Titanic, Disaster at Sea. This book was written by Martin Jenkins and Brian Sanders. At 9 o'clock in the evening on Thursday, April 18th, 1912, in the middle of a tremendous thunderstorm, an ocean liner pulled slowly into New York Harbor and prepared to dock. This ship was the Carpathia, one of dozens that regularly piled to and fro across the North Atlantic. Normally, her arrival would have attracted little attention among the hustle and bustle of the busy port. But this time, it was different. Tens of thousands of people had crammed themselves into the dockside and were waiting expectantly. For the Carpathia carried not just her own passengers and crew, but the traumatized survivors of a terrible calamity as well. 4 days earlier, on the night of Sunday, April 14th, the world's largest ship, the Titanic, had hit an iceberg in the middle of the ocean and sunk. Nearly 1,500 people had died. It was the worst ever single shipwreck at sea. Thanks to wireless technology, news of the event had begun to spread almost immediately, so that the late editions of the Monday newspaper in Europe and North America were already reporting that the great ship had suffered some kind of accident. Many of these accounts, though, turned out to be wildly inaccurate. Some said that the liner had been badly damaged, but was still afloat and was being towed to Halifax, Nova Scotia for repairs. Others reported that the Titanic had indeed sunk, but that all the people on board had been rescued. By Tuesday, as more detailed reports filtered through from the Carpathia and other ships that had rushed to the scene, the scale of the disaster and the awful loss of life had become clear. The world was in shock. The Titanic, a brand new ship, this was her first voyage across the Atlantic, and she incorporated the last innovations in shipbuilding technology. Her builders and virtually everyone else believed that she was practically unsinkable. Over the next few weeks, official inquiries into the accident were held in New York and London. Survivors were interviewed and dozens of expert witnesses cross-examined. Both inquiries had the same goal: to find out exactly what had happened, why it had happened, and who, if anyone, was to blame. The age of the ocean liner. The Titanic began her short existence on March 31st, 1909, when her keel was laid down in the shipyards of Harland and Wolff, a shipbuilding company based in Belfast, Northern Ireland. She had been dreamed up just under 2 years before, in the summer of 1907, by J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line Shipping Company, and Lord Pirret, chairman of the board of Harland and Wolff. At the time, mass air travel was still decades away, and the only means of carrying people and cargo across the sea was by ship. During the previous half-century, steam had been taking over from sail as the main way that ships were powered. The White Star Line was one of many steamships companies that had sprung up, all competing for a share of the trade, particularly on the most profitable route across the Atlantic between Europe and North America. The Blue Ribbon. In the 1860s, a rivalry developed between different companies as to which could cross the Atlantic the fastest. An unofficial prize, the Blue Ribbon, was awarded to whichever ship held the record, bringing with it great publicity for the company that owned the ship. Among the main companies competing for the Blue Ribbon were the White Star Line and its arch-rival, Cunard Thomas Ismay, Bruce Ismay's father, owner of the White Star Line at this time, realized that there were more and more rich people wanting to travel, and that they didn't want just speed, they wanted luxury as well. Ismay commissioned a new kind of liner from Harland and Wolff, which was both very fast and very, very comfortable, especially in first class. The new liners were a great success, but eventually Ismay decided that it was simply too expensive to build liners that were both the most luxurious and the fastest afloat. So he chose to leave the race for the blue ribbard to Cunard and the others. Though no longer competing for the prize, White Star ships would still be fast, but they would also certainly be the most comfortable. Thomas Ismay died in 1899, and his son Bruce took over the firm. Then, in 1902, the American tycoon J.P. Morgan gained control of the business and made it part of the Shipping Combined International Mercantile Marine. Though Bruce Ismay continued to run the White Star Line, Ismay launched a range of increasingly large ships, culminating in the Oceanic in 1899 and the Celtic in 1901. The Celtic in 1901, at the time of the biggest ships ever to have been built. Then, in 1906, the company's pride was defeated, a terrible blow. Their rival, Cunard, launched the Mauretania and the Louisiana liners that were even bigger, faster, and more luxurious. They could complete the transatlantic journey in under 6 days, and not surprisingly, they quickly grabbed the lion's share of the passenger trade. Olympic, Titanic, and Gigantic. Bruce Ismay, the Lord and Lord Prior, knew they had to respond to the challenge and decided that they would go one better by building 3 new liners to be called the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Gigantic, later renamed the Britannic. They would be bigger than the Cunard ships, carry more passengers, and be even more luxurious, if not quite as fast. Designs were quickly sketched out, and preparations made to start building. It was decided to stagger the construction so that experience gained with the first ship could be applied to the building of the others. First would come the Olympic, then the Titanic, then the Gigantic. The keel of the Olympian was laid down in December 1907. She took 3 years to build and was finally ready for launching in October 1910, by which time work on the Titanic was already far advanced. Although the original plans for the 2 ships had been almost identical, as building went on, various changes were made to the Titanic's design. In particular, it was decided to make some of the first-class facilities even larger and more luxurious. This meant that the Titanic would end up weighing about 1,000 tons more than the Olympic, making her the world's biggest ship. Launch day. The Titanic's launch date was eventually set at May 31st, 1911, the same day that Harland and Wolff were due to hand over the Olympic to the White Star Line. It was a great occasion in Belfast, where shipbuilding was by far the most important industry, and it seemed as if half of the city turned out to see the 2 ships. Lord Prior was there, of course, as well as Bruce Ismay and his wife and children. Even J.P. Morgan himself turned up. At the center of them all was Thomas Andrews, the managing director of the shipyard, who had personally overseen the construction of the 2 ships and had played an important part in their design. Although the Titanic was now afloat, she still needed a lot of work before she was ready for service. Her interior needed to be fitted out, her funnels built, and engines and other machinery installed. All this took nearly a year, but gradually the ship neared completion. She really was awe-inspiring. Everything about her was big, from her propellers to her first-class dining room. Steam power. The Titanic's power came from 3 huge steam engines. To the left and right sides of the ship were 2 traditional-style piston or reciprocating engines, the largest of their kind ever built, nearly 40 feet tall. The third, center engine was the turbine, powered by used steam and from 2 reciprocating engines. 200 men were needed to keep the fires lit, and when the ship was traveling at cruising speed, they went through nearly 600 tons of coal every 24 hours. Smoke from the fireboxes escaped through the first 3 of the ship's funnels. The 4th funnel wasn't, in fact, necessary, but it was there because the ship's designers thought that the ship would look odd without it. Instead, it was used as a giant ventilation shaft, carrying cooking smells away from the ship's galley. Accommodations and facilities. Built around the engines and the boilers were the decks, all 9 of them, with the accommodations and facilities needed to house the passengers and crew, more than 3,000 people if the ship was full. The topmost deck, the boat deck, housed the ship's officers, while the bottommost, known as the orlop, contained only storerooms. The passengers and the rest of the crew were distributed around the 7 decks in between, named from A to G. Passenger accommodations was divided into first class, second class, third class. Each class occupied separate parts of the ship, and each had its own facilities. On first class, they had Turkish baths, electric baths, and a swimming pool and a gymnasium, a squash court, a barber shop, a dark room, a clothes pressing room, a smoking room, a reading and writing room, a lounge, and a lending library. For eating, a huge first-class dining saloon on D dock, and a separate a la carte restaurant by Luigi Gotti on deck B. First-class passengers also had exclusive access to the glassed-in promenade on A deck and to 3 electric elevators that could send telegrams from the Marconi wireless rooms to friends and family. On second class, they had an electric elevator reserved exclusively for second-class passengers. They used a promenade on the boat deck, a smoking room, and a library, and a large dining salon on D deck. For third class, they had a promenade on the poop deck, a smoking room, and a general room on C deck, as well as dining saloon on F deck. Third-class passengers were kept strictly apart from those in first and second class. Designed for safety. Travel by ship was potentially a dangerous business, and the big shipping companies went to considerable lengths to make their passenger ships safe. It had long been practice for such ships to be built double bottoms, that is, with a watertight inner layer above the keel, with what were called collision bulkheads. Strong watertight walls running across the ship near the front and the back. If the ship ran into anything or scraped the keel on rocks in shallow waters and was holed as a result, the water would flood only a small area. This would not be enough to sink the ship. However, neither a double bottom nor collision bulkhead could protect a boat completely. So more modern ships went farther still. Some, like the Lusitania and the Mauritania, had complete double hulls. The Olympic and the Titanic took another route. They were divided by bulkheads into a series of watertight compartments, 16 in all. If any 3 compartments were filled with water, and in some conditions, if 4 were flooded, the ships would still float. Wireless technology. Not only were the new ships considered very hard to sink, but the wireless technology developed by Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi at the turn of the century also made it much easier for them to call for help if they did get into trouble. Wireless installations were by now pretty much standard on larger ships. Lifeboat provisions. With the design of ships improving all the time and a long record of safe voyages on British boats, the ship owners and the authorities who regulated shipping in Britain, this was the Board of Trade, they decided that lifeboats were not a priority. The minimum number of lifeboats was set using a formula based on the weight of the ship. This had last been updated in 1894, when passenger ships all weighed less than 20,000 tons. This meant that ships like the Olympic and the Titanic which were built to carry a maximum of about 3,500 people each, had to have lifeboat space for only 962 passengers, fewer than 1 in 3 of the people who might be on board, although they were supposed to have life jackets for everyone. In fact, the Titanic had more lifeboats than was required by the rules, as it had 16 normal lifeboats and 4 collapsible ones that between them were designed to hold 1,178 people. The normal lifeboats and 2 of the collapsible ones, referred to as C and D, were mounted on the davits, which are special hoists for raising and lowering the boats on the boat deck. The other 2 collapsible boats, A and B, were rather oddly stored on the roof of the officers' quarters. Voyage preparations. On Tuesday, April 2nd, 1912, the Titanic left the dock in Belfast under the command of Edward J. Smith, the most experienced of the White Star Line's captains. She sailed down the Irish Sea to Southampton in preparation for her maiden voyage to New York, set to begin on Wednesday, April 10th. For the next week, the ship became the center of a mass of activity. The finishing touches were made inside, deliveries taken on board, and the crew was recruited. All aboard. Finally, Wednesday, April 10th arrived. The crew members were all expected to be on board by 6 a.m. to attend an 8 a.m. muster and to be sure that the ship would be ready to receive the passengers, most of whom would be coming down from London by boat train. The earliest to arrive were the second and third class passengers who had taken the 7:30 train from Waterloo Station. There were nearly 500 people traveling third class and around 240 booked into second class. Many of the third-class passengers were immigrants from Scandinavia who had crossed the North Sea on other ships. Some were single men off to seek their fortunes. Others were wives and children, joining husbands who had already settled in the New World. Often whole families were traveling together with one aim: to escape poverty in their homeland and find something better in America or Canada. Many would have saved for months or even years to raise the price of their tickets. These passengers would have made their way up the third-class gangway to be briefly checked over by a team of doctors who were particularly on the lookout for trachoma, a very infectious eye disease. No one with trachoma would be allowed into the United States, and anyone showing symptoms would be immediately turned off the ship. Everyone else was quickly directed to the sleeping quarters by the third-class stewards. The second-class passengers, meanwhile, came on board by a different gangway and made their way to the purser's office, from where they were directed to their staterooms. The first-class passengers had a much more leisurely time. Their boat train did not arrive until 11:30, just a half an hour before the Titanic was due to set sail, although many would have sent their luggage and servants in advance. Nearly 200 first-class passengers embarked at Southampton. Many were wealthy Americans returning from vacations or business trips to Europe. Setting sail. At 12 o'clock sharp, the ship was ready to leave. As the last gangway was being pulled away, 8 firemen who had signed on as crew but had sneaked off to a pub came dashing up. 3 of them made it on board, while the others waited for a passenger train to go by in front of them. By the time the other 5 got to the dockside, the officer guarding the gangway had decided that they were too late to be let on the ship. After arguing for a while, the seamen turned away, having just missed out on 2 weeks' paid work. The Titanic sounded a long blast of her whistle, and the Southampton tugboats pulled and pushed her away from the dockside, guided by the harbor pilot, George Bower. Finally, she was off. She was making her way slowly down the narrow channel toward the open sea when there was a sudden flurry of excitement. The movement of water created by her passing made a much smaller liner, the New York, break her moorings and start drifting right into the path of the bigger ship. Quick action by the captain in one of the tugs, and by Captain Smith and George Bower, who pulled the Titanic's engines immediately into reverse, saved the day. The two liners missed each other by only scarcely more than a few feet. Cherbourg, France. There were no other mishaps, and soon the Titanic was in the English Channel, steaming towards Cherbourg, her first port of call. She arrived there at 6:30 in the evening, a couple of hours later than planned, thanks largely to the incident with the New York. The ship dropped anchor offshore, only to be met by two White Star tenders, small ferry boats specifically designed for carrying passengers, freight, and mail to and from the dock. 22 passengers who were making the short journey from Southampton to Cherbourg disembarked. While they were leaving, 274 new passengers came on board, 142 first class, 30 second class, and 102 third class. They had arrived in Cherbourg on the train Transatlantique, the special boat train that had left Paris that morning. The third-class passengers were a mix of nationalities, many from the Eastern Mediterranean or the Near East, including Croatians, Syrians, and Armenians. With all the passengers safely stowed, the Titanic weighed anchor just after 8 p.m. and set off once more. Queenstown, Ireland. At 11:30 the next morning, the Titanic stopped about 2 miles off the Queenstown in Ireland to pick up the Irish mail and her last remaining passengers, a handful traveling to New York second class and just over 100 immigrants in third class. At the same time, one crew member, John Coffey, jumped ship, and 7 passengers who had booked fares from Southampton to Queenstown disembarked. One of them was Francis Brown, an amateur photographer who had spent much of his time on board taking pictures of the new ship. Into the Atlantic. At 1:30 on the afternoon of Thursday, April 11th, the Titanic headed out into the Atlantic, expecting to arrive in New York on the morning of Wednesday, April 17th. She was far from full, but even so, she was carrying more than 2,000 people. Things seemed to have quickly settled down on board. The weather was good, and many passengers were apparently very impressed with how smooth sailing the Titanic was. Those on her higher decks could hardly feel the vibrations of her enormous engines. There were few glitches, of course, but there was a smoldering fire in one of the coal-burnt bunkers, not finally put out until Saturday morning, and up in the crow's nest, the binoculars used by the lookouts were missing. They had apparently been there in their special locker when the ship had left Belfast, but now they were gone. Nobody knew where. Most of the passengers passed the time between meals, chatting, playing cards, or reading, while the more energetic ones in first class could try out the gymnasium or challenge the ship's own professional squash player to a match. First and second class passengers could also amuse themselves by sending wireless messages to family and friends ashore or even on other ships via one of the 2 Marconi wireless operators. The outward southern track. The ship made good progress, covering more than 870 miles between midday Thursday and midday Saturday. The captain then increased the ship's speed to just under 22 knots, so that by midday on Sunday, she would have covered another 545 miles. The Titanic was following the so-called outward southern track. The big steamship companies had agreed in 1899 that their westbound ships would follow this route between January 15th and August 14th each year, in order to avoid areas where there was a danger of encountering ice and fog. Sunday, April 14th, the fated day dawns. break here. Sunday, April 14th, the fated day dawns. Although the outward southern track skirted to the south of the main sea ice areas, it was well known that icebergs were still likely to be encountered, particularly in the months of April, May, and June. Sure enough, at 9 a.m. on Sunday, April 14th, the Marconi operators received Morse code messages from Captain Barr, commanding the steamship Caronia, saying, "Captain, Titanic, westbound steamers report bergs, growlers, and field ice in 42 degrees north from 49 degrees to 51 degrees west. 14th April, compliments, Barr." This was almost exactly where the Titanic was headed. During the course of that day, half a dozen more messages containing warnings of ice ahead were received by the radio operators. All messages about navigation were supposed to be passed on to the ship's captain, who should have made sure that they were posted in the chart room on the ship's bridge, so that all the officers would be able to read them. There was no proper system in place to do this, however. Some of the messages certainly did reach the captain. One from the Baltic was handed to the Captain Smith at about 2 in the afternoon, although not posted on the chart room until 7:15 that evening. Some, though, almost certainly never left the Marconi room. Evening falls. Even though not all the messages had gotten through to them, the ship's officers knew to be on the lookout for ice. They had an added warning since the temperature started to drop very sharply after sunset. Although there was virtually no wind, this was good, though not certain, a sign that there was ice around. For the first part of the evening, everything went normally. All of the Titanic's boilers had been fired up, and she was now steaming ahead at 22 knots. At 9 p.m., the captain, who had been dining with some of the first-class passengers, came to the bridge and discussed the conditions with Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who had been on watch since 6 p.m. They both agreed that the very calm sea and the fact that there was no moon might make it difficult to spot any icebergs, especially ones that had recently turned over. These looked black or dark blue rather than white, and would not show up easily in the starlight. If there had been any wind, even a slight breeze, there would have been waves lapping around the base of the bergs, forming white breakers that would have been much easier to spot from a distance. At 9:30 p.m., the captain retired to his cabin.